Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Stevens Valley Church Sunday School. And let me get my computer all set up here. There we go. I think we're ready to go. Thank you for joining us here on YouTube. It's actually a Zoom recording that's played on YouTube. Thanks to Pastor Heath for uploading it for me. We're going to continue this morning our look at Revelation. And we'll be going into chapter 13, and it's probably one of the more frequently referenced chapters in all of Revelation. If anyone knows anything, even casually, about the book of Revelation, they will know something about the mark of the beast, and that's where we are today. And when we get through with this, it probably won't be as satisfying to you as you would like it to be. But what we want to do is to make sure that we get the central point, the main point that the Holy Spirit wants us to receive from this. So just bear with me as we go through. We'll hit some major points and try to stay on track. So let me go ahead and get our slideshow going here, and we'll jump right into Revelation chapter 13. We're going to be looking at the mark of the beast today, chapter 13. And as we said before, it's important for us to remain aware of the literary structure of this particular letter. It's really more important when we're looking at Revelation than it is really any other book that I've studied, because the way it is connected together, the sum of the parts just really enhance the overall meaning. So we have to make sure we understand how one part relates to the next. And it really does make understanding the book somewhat easier if we'll do that. So in that regard, and trying to understand the literary structure and keep that in front of us here, chapter 13 will be part of a logical section that encompasses chapter 12, verse 1, all the way through chapter 15 and verse 4. This follows the account in which we were introduced to the sea dragon, and the woman whose child he was attempting to destroy. So this chapter 13 is part of this larger section that will contain actually 7 scenes. And these 7 scenes, two of them are in this chapter. Now remember again, chapter 12 did introduce us to the sea dragon. He was identified as Satan, or the devil, which means accuser and deceiver. So those are main characters here, and we also were introduced to the woman. And the dragon was intent upon destroying her yet unborn child, and we identified that child later as the Messiah, the one who is to rule all nations. And Satan was intent upon destroying that child in order to usurp his authority. But having failed to, as the child was taken up to the throne, and having failed to thwart the work of Christ, then Satan then chose to do as much damage as he could to God's people. So he pursued the woman, the people of God, into the wilderness in a type and antitype of the deliverance of the people of God from Egypt some 1,500 years prior to this writing. So he pursues this woman into the wilderness and is given the right by God to persecute her for 1,260 days, a very common number in Revelation and in Daniel. Phrased in various ways, but this really represents the time from the first to the second coming of Christ. So Satan's weapon, though, that we saw there that he's going to use against God's people is deception. That is his principal weapon. Now today we're going to be introduced to 2 of his agents. There are 3, and we will see 2 of them introduced here in chapter 13 in 2 different scenes. And these are agents of his deception and persecution on behalf of Satan. So chapter 13 then will in essence be parallel with chapter 12 verse 6, if you want to go back and look at that, and chapter 12 verses 13 through 17. It's really just an extrapolation or an expansion of what we saw there in 12:6 and 13:17. It's going to be more fully fleshed out here in chapter 13. So what I would like to do is read the entire chapter 13 and go back and look at it and try to keep as much unity as we can. It's very important in this particular chapter. So bear with me as we read these verses from God's Word, Revelation chapter 13. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of his heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast, and they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Now that's 1,260 days, by the way. It opens its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. It also was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it, given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captive he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for endurance and faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth, and it had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Well, we certainly have our work cut out for us here and trying to understand this in light of all the sensational imagery here. But I think if you remember back to previous lessons, you can see some similarities between this and the vision that is recorded by Daniel in chapter 7. So let's read just a few of those verses and put it all together. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. And as I looked at its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, "Arise, devour much flesh." After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had iron teeth, and it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which the 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes, and the eyes of a man, and the mouth speaking great things. Well, maybe this adds some clarity to it. We'll see. But what I would like for us to do is to consider that this really fits an ancient Jewish concept of beasts that were coming up out of the sea and a beast that was on the land. In Job, for example, Job the Lord says to Job, "Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox." And then later in chapter 41, he says, Can you draw out the Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? There was a Jewish legend, a Jewish understanding that God made 2 beasts, one on the land and one in the sea, which opposed him, which God would later conquer. And it's probably based upon that Daniel drew his imagery, and from that, then John drew his imagery from Daniel. So let's look at Daniel's prophecy for just a moment. There were 4 kingdoms. They were likened to a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then one so terrible that it was not even compared to an animal. It would be so terrifying that there was no animal to compare it to. So Daniel was actually given that an interpretation here. There would be four kingdoms that would arise, and they would oppress God's people. And this was probably a reference to four kingdoms: Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. That's a fairly common interpretation of Daniel's of the four kingdoms, and I think it's probably true. But since the last beast is given the right to trample the people of God for times and a half time, that would be 1,260 days, 42 months. That's the same time the dragon was given to persecute the children of God in Revelation 12. So if we take the Roman Empire to be the fourth beast of Daniel 7, it must include the Roman Empire, but it must transcend it as well. So the Roman Empire does not exhaust the meaning of the fourth beast in Daniel, okay? So Jewish literature in the second temple period, saw the fourth beast as transcending Rome, and thus representing all kingdoms that would oppress God's people from Rome on through the rest of time. So let's compare then Revelation and Daniel, because they are obviously related. So John saw one beast with four heads. Daniel saw four beasts. Three of them had a single head. One had four. But John saw one beast with four heads. Daniel saw three with a single head and one with four. But they were similar. The lion, the bear, and the leopard are common in the two visions. They describe the beasts in Daniel and the single beast there in Revelation. So the fourth beast in Daniel has 10 horns, as does the one in Revelation. And the fourth beast speaks great things, and the beast in Revelation is described as, who is like the beast? He is so great, how can you describe him? So we're beginning to build a similarity here between the description of the beast that Daniel saw in chapter 7 and what John is describing here in chapter 13. I think the conclusion should be this, that the beast in Revelation must represent an earthly kingdom empowered by Satan. We saw that in verse 4. The sea beast gave his power to the beast from the sea. And he's given power to persecute God's people for times and a half time, the same length of time that we saw back in Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 12:14. What we're really talking about is the same oppressive kingdom that was represented by the fourth beast in Daniel chapter 7 is now being represented here in Revelation chapter 13. So the power of the beast is depicted by the 10 horns, and I believe the 7 head indicates just the completion of the power and the purpose of the 4 that were depicted there in Daniel. So this would be a composite, if you will, of what Daniel had seen, but it transcends what Daniel saw there. So it would include Rome, this fourth beast, and this beast that John sees, but it would transcend Rome to include all oppressive governments, just as the little horn of Daniel's vision persecuted God's people to the end of days. So critically, though, what is going to be the means of persecution? 12:13 through 17 indicated that Satan's weapon was deception, and John's vision indicates that. So this vision in 13 indicates that. The deception is based upon the similarities of the beast and the lamb. How do we get that? Well, both the lamb and the beast have swords. We saw that of the lamb in chapter 2, and we see it of the beast here in chapter 13. Their followers have names on their foreheads back in chapter 7 and now in chapter 13. The lamb has 7 horns, as we saw in chapter 5 and verse 6, and the beast has 10 horns, chapter 13 and verse 1. And critically, in chapter 5 and verse 6, the lamb was in the great throne room scene. The lamb was described as standing as slain. And in 13:3, the beast had a mortal wound, but its mortal wound had healed. Now, interestingly, the word here for wound is translated in other places in Revelation, many times in Revelation, as plague, indicating that this mortal wound, this supposedly mortal wound, was inflicted by God. So then further, finally, the Lamb ransomed people from every tribe, language, and nation, and the beast was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation. I think you can see the imagery here is so close together that there is almost a comparison between the lamb and this beast that was stood as if slain. So let's look at this comparison a little bit more. The similarities, I think, are to establish the beast as a false lamb, and therefore it transcends any particular ruler or kingdom. It would have been true of some of the Roman rulers, but it has been true of many others since that time and will be true in the future. So it is not the beast, though, that is claiming to be the lamb. This is John's observation, and that's an important concept for us. The beast is not claiming to be the lamb. John is saying he is seeing a similarity in picturing them between the lamb and this beast, and this is given to him by the Spirit. So think back in Genesis 3, verses 4 and 5, Satan's deception of the woman and of Adam, who was there with her, was that man can be like God. In other words, God doesn't have any inherent or ontological right to have dominion over man. Okay, man can be like God. God does not have any inherent right to rule. Well, Satan was then promised that since they fell for that deception and fell into sin and took the race with it, Satan was then promised that the offspring of Eve would bruise his head. And that was in chapter 3 and verse 15. And that established the theme of history, one that before the cross, the beast attempted to prevent, and the one after the cross, he attempts to refute. So that's what deception would be, would it not? Thus, the beast's deception is not so much mimicking Christ and his authority as denying Christ's efficacious work at his death and resurrection. You see? So really, the very essence and power of the beast is being presented as evidence that Christ did not win a decisive victory at the cross over Satan, because he's apparently been resurrected. I use the word apparently there, because the wound that he received by God at the cross has not subdued him to the point that he's lost all ability to affect God's people. So there is the likeness between the beast and the lamb. So this would represent then a beastly government that Satan is going to use to not only deceive, but to oppress and repress God's people. So any government that bases its laws on anything other than the revealed will of God is a manifestation of the beast. Let me say that again. Any government that bases its laws on anything other than the law of God, the revealed will of God, is a manifestation of the beast. So in Rome, that was very common. The mantra there was Dominus et Deus. Caesar was Lord and God, Master and God. Okay, so they're calling him a God. And the cry of the French Revolution centuries later was neither God nor master. So what we're doing is denying God his rightful rule over people and denying his rightful rule to be Lord of our lives. So even monarchies and oligarchies, those that are ruled by one person or a small group of people, they're fallen men and they rule for the benefit of few, and they are inherently unjust. A democracy is an inherently corrupt and unjust form of government unless it is based upon the will of God. So if you have a democracy in which all people agree that the will of God is supreme, then a democracy is just. But if you have a democracy where there's not the common understanding, then it is an inherently unjust form of government. But the key word in all of this is justice. And this is the word that Plato had so much difficulty in defining. How do you define what justice is? Well, a definition, it's a legal term, and a definition for justice must ultimately go back to the covenant of faith in the garden. So all of these governments that we see, the one in Rome and the one, all others since then, may be a partial fulfillment of the ultimate fulfillment to come that Paul records for us in 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 12 of the coming Antichrist. And I'll let you read that on your own. But what I'm trying to show is that all governments will serve the purposes of the sea dragon, of Satan, by deceiving people and robbing God of his glory and repressing God's people. So then there's the statement there in Revelation that says that that people must resign themselves to the coming persecution. That's taken from Jeremiah, because Jeremiah records, when they ask you, where shall you go? You shall say to them, thus saith the Lord, those who are for pestilence to pestilence, and those who are for the sword to the sword, those who are for famine to famine, and those who are for captivity to captivity. And he shall come and strike the land of Egypt, giving it over to this pestilence, those who are doomed to the pestilence, to captivity, those who are doomed to captivity, and to the sword, those who are doomed to the sword. Well, there Jeremiah is talking about the inevitability of God's punishment upon the wicked for their idolatry. But here in Revelation, he's talking about God's people should change their perspective and look toward the eternal rather than dwelling on the temporal, because persecutions are coming. Well, there's another beast, though, and this is the beast from the earth. All governments must be supported by an education system and by a sympathetic religion or philosophy to give it validity. All governments, if it's going to survive, must have an education system to indoctrinate people and a sympathetic religion or philosophy that will give it validity. So it's possible that John is indicating in this description of this beast from the earth, this false religion, as we'll see, he's probably indicating a threat to the covenant community. So if we remember back to the letters to the churches, we saw all sorts of false religions being perpetrated there. So it's possible that John is saying, here's the beast from the earth. He serves the sea dragon. So be careful of your theology. Because in this beast, it's a parody of the lamb. You saw the lamb being mimicked here in its appearance. But remember what Christ said. For Christ said, for false Christs and prophets will arise and perform great signs. And that's what we read here in Revelation. And perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. So there's coming a time, according to Christ's words, that false Christ will come and deceive people with the things that they are allowed to do by God's authority. They are allowed to do, and many will be deceived. And that is possible, what John is saying to the community back there in Asia Minor, because it was well reported that the keepers of those pagan temples were very adept at orchestrating things that seemed to be sensational things to support the deity of their of their idols. But also, it could be a reference to coming days in which Satan and his demons actually do empower some to do seemingly miraculous deeds to deceive God's people or to deceive the nations. We saw this already when we looked at the deliverance from Egypt, where God empowered the magicians there to deceive those people, to harden them. And again, we saw this this repeated phrase here in Revelation 13, that he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. All of these things will be interpreted properly by God's people, but they will deceive and harden those who do not belong to God. So what is the mark that is going to be placed upon these people that belong to the beast? Remember back that when we were going through the letters, that it was not possible for Christians to participate in those idolatrous feasts because of their theology, because of their belief in God as that one and only God, and it would be really mutiny against him. But it was necessary, on the other hand, to participate with them to some degree, because you had to work. And the unions or the trade guilds were wound tightly together with the religion of the day. So this left the church, the Christians there, with a great deal of difficulty in making a living, because they did not have the authority to buy and sell in that community, because it was so tightly wound with the idolatry of the region. But this mark that this beast puts on the hands or the heads of his people is a parody or mimicking the sealing of God's people that we saw back in chapter 7. And remember, back in it, we read this back when we worked on that chapter, but Exodus 13:9. He's talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread here, but look how he describes it. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. So here, he's talking about the observance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread as being a sign on the hand of his people. And then he says it shall be as a mark, continuing to talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. really what he's talking about is ownership. The Lord seals his people. It's a sign of ownership. He gives them a new name. Well, here, the beast marks his people too as a sign of allegiance and ownership that they would have for him. So the mark of the beast, and the more sensational part of this chapter, the number of the beast. The early church fathers cautioned against assigning any specific identity to this man that is referenced here in chapter 13. In fact, Irenaeus proposed that this number, 666, represented apostasy throughout the age. He does so in his work against heresies, and I give you the reference there if you want to look that up. But the church fathers generally did not believe that this was a reference to a single man. But in the 19th century, it became popular to assign numbers to letters, for example, Nero or some other infamous person, and then sum those numbers up to see if we could come up with 666 and see who would be, through this numerology, assign, see if we can identify the name. Well, that's not really satisfactory because there are a lot of manipulations that had to be made. For Nero, for example, you had to add Caesar after his name. So Nero Caesar, you had to translate that from the Latin into the Greek and from the Greek into the Hebrew, and then you actually had to add a letter or two, and you could finally come up with 666. Well, I think you can see there's a lot of manipulation to that, and we really shouldn't put much confidence in it. So what does it mean? Well, there's another way to look at this, and that is the Greek verse is not definitive. In other words, it's a little bit ambiguous because the phrase 666 is the number of a man can just equally as well be translated 666 is the number of man. Now, many have noted through this that the use of the sixth seal and the sixth trumpet brought judgment upon mankind. Well, that's interesting, but also consider that man was created on the sixth day, after which God rested on the seventh day. So had Adam been faithful to the covenant, he could have entered God's rest, but he was not faithful to that. So, but look what the Hebrew author says in regards to this. Therefore, the Holy Spirit says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of the testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore, I was provoked with that generation, and I said, they will always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Okay. Could it be then that 666 indicates this faithless failure of man multiplied over and over and over? For rest is only in God. And through the deception by this beast, through the deception of so many, they will never enter the rest. They will always be incomplete and never really enter into day 7. That is my best take on Revelation 13. I hope it wasn't too quick for you. My voice is not really good tonight. I had some minor surgery on it during the week, and it's not really clear. I apologize for that. But I hope you'll consider what we've said here. The central points are these. 1, Satan will work through oppressive government to deceive people and to rob God of his glory and to oppress God's people. But supporting that government will be false religion or false philosophy, whether it's utilitarianism, whether it's empiricism, whether it's rationalism, it doesn't matter. Whatever system of thought you have, it's not centered in the revelation of God and centered upon God and his revealed will. That will be used to support the work of Satan. So next week, we'll move on into chapter 14, and I think we'll probably do chapter 15 too. And next week, it will also be only on YouTube, not at the church building, because of some virus exposure that Marty and I have had. We'll stay away from people for one more week. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have questions for me, be sure to email them to me, and I'll see that I answer them personally. And if appropriate, I will try to answer it as class begins next week. So all of you stay safe, and join us again next week, next Sunday, as we go into Revelation chapter 14 and 15. God bless you and keep you, and make his face to shine upon you.